Equinor answer was almost surprising. They didn't answer anything, but they told me, for example, they didn't consider the tides, which is, you know, so what are you considering then?
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada and sometimes elsewhere by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking to Carlos França about Equinor's explorations and dealings around oil in Brazil. We're also going to be talking a little bit about how they measure spill response times and things like spill impact, both in Brazil and in Canada, and we're going to be chatting about some of the disastrous climate impacts that Brazil has seen and why we need to act quickly on reducing oil and gas emissions and why Canada needs to be a part of that too, and countries like Norway and Canada need to do more. For context of today's episode, Sierra Club Canada is part of an international campaign against Equinor's oil and gas expansion plans across the world. Equinor is the Norwegian majority state-owned oil and gas company, and together with allies around the planet, we are trying to push back for a safe climate and for safe oceans and safe environments. In Canada, Norway's Equinor has proposed the Bay du Nord oil and gas project, which could be a disaster for the local environment if ever constructed, would be a disaster for the climate, and definitely sets us on the wrong course economically towards an economically unsustainable future. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. Hi, Carlos. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Connor.
So for those tuning in, tell us who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, I'm Carlos França. I'm physicist and oceanographer by the University of São Paulo, where I worked for more than 30 years, and basically on sea level and physical oceanography of the South and the Equatorial Atlantic. Well, after quitting the university, I started doing some consultancy on scientific projects, and more recently, we decided to create an NGO called ICO, which is Instituto de Cultura Oceânica, for exchanging knowledge about the ocean with the local community. And of course, the main issue is the global changes and the whole of the ocean.
I know in the Canadian context, we've heard many fisheries are threatened by the changes in the ocean conditions that are happening.
Well, not only fisheries, but also the erosion, coastal communities are starting to be affected. Also by extreme events that are already occurring, and particularly in my region, which is São Paulo, which is state south of Rio de Janeiro, about 500 kilometers south of Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah, and you're getting a lot of storms and more severe weather events.
Yes, very severe weather. Last year, we had a very high storm with about 700 millimeters of water, precipitated water. So
that's a huge amount.
It's a huge amount. It occurs only on very, very large hurricanes, and we don't have hurricanes in Brazil. But we had this very, very large amount of water, and we had people dying from landslides, flooding the low-lying areas. It was very bad, very, very bad.
We had two two major flooding events recently in a large city in Canada, but it was nowhere near that amount of water, and
No,
it was just,
yeah,
and the impacts were not the same level at all, but it was amazing how much the entire city was just impacted by
yeah,
this amount of water that wasn't even close to that.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
yeah. I know today you're part of the international campaign against Equinor's oil and gas projects. I'm curious to get a sense of what has Equinor been doing in Brazil.
Well, Equinor is in Brazil for more than 20 years now. I
Hmm.
know that because when I was at university, and some people were hired as consultant to Equinor, what was then called State Oil, not
Hmm.
Equinor. They arrived when the oil monopoly was broken in Brazil in the late 90s. And they were operating an oil field near the offshore of the Rio de Janeiro state. And I knew them by that time. But after that, we found in Brazil a very large amount of oil in the pre-salt layer. And this pre-salt layer is in Santos Basin, which is offshore of my state, São Paulo. At that time, the then government decided to create strict laws to exploit this area, this pre-salt area. But then this law was against change, and the international companies were able then to exploit this area. And Equinor has bought the very best oil field in this area, which is called now Bacalhau, but was then known as Carcará.
Bacalhau means cod, correct? Codfish?
Yes,
Yeah,
codfish.
yeah.
Bacalhau means codfish, and in Brazil, codfish is known for coming from Norway. So that's a very significant change of name of this oil field for us.
Interesting. So what have the consultations been like for the project?
In Brazil, I think it's like most of the world. You have to have a license from an environmental agency to explore in oil and particularly offshore. So you have to prepare and present an environmental impact report to this agency, and when approved, this report goes to the society in a public hearing, to the society criticize it or know about it,
Hmm.
and just only after that have a license to explore the oil. So that's what is happening now with this oil field of Bacalhau. They are trying to get the license. I already have an interim license, at least as I know. It's a public hearing. So you can participate, anyone can participate. But of course, there's not much people that can say something about those projects.
Yeah.
And that's it's quite limited. But the Bacalhau hearings was the first time I've participated of one of those hearings, and it was virtual because it was during the pandemics, during the COVID pandemic. So
Mm.
I participated online, talking to this both Equinor from one side and IBAMA, which is the environmental agency in Brazil.
And so what are some of the risks you've identified with the Bacalhau project?
Well, oil exploitation at sea has two dimensions. One is the problem of climate change, which is, you take the oil from the soil and burn it to the atmosphere. So it's a problem which are to have to deal with. But this is some kind of global policies that have to deal with. The other dimension is the risk of an oil spill. It's the core of this environmental impact report. And well, the report of Equinor was not well done. So I questioning them, I challenge the quality of the report and the quality of the physics in the report. So we are still in this place. We don't have an satisfactory answer from them so far.
Because I know from some of the times we've talked previously, they had initially said that like if there was an oil spill, it would be contained to a small area. Some of the research you've done has looked at how that isn't necessarily the case.
In the report, there was a statement, almost a mantra, saying the oil would not reach this coast. And in a case of oil spill, the oil would not reach the coast. So the fishing industry, no problem because the oil wouldn't reach the coast. But in the core of this report, it's a hydrodynamic model, numerical model, associated with an oil spill model. So this hydrodynamic model, which is my main area of interest, was severely underestimating the physics, the currents, particularly the currents of the area, which I know quite well from previous work. So I challenged them this statement in this public hearing. I told them, well, if you correct this model, the hydrodynamic model, the oil will reach the coast. And then, well, I've had a very unsatisfactory answer from them. And then I start to look for help to try to halt this licensing process. And then, well, several steps to do that, but so far not successful.
Basically, for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the hydrodynamic, what you're saying is the ocean current model that they were using was much less severe than in reality. So if you actually take into account the ocean currents, yes, the oil would spread farther or potentially reach the coast.
Yes, yes, that's exactly the problem. And the answer I've written to them, to the environmental agency, telling them the problems I saw in the model. And Equinor answer was almost surprising. They didn't answer anything, but they told me, for example, they didn't consider the tides, which is, you know, so what are you considering then?
Yeah.
I've asked them if they have considered also waves, for example, or wind. What are
Yeah.
talking about this model?
It's a fairly
And
major thing, the tides.
so
Yeah.
they didn't consider it, just like that.
Yeah.
They didn't consider it in the oil spill model associated with the hydrodynamic model, So it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable.
But we had a similar issue in Canada where they had told us the response time for a spill was going to be 18 to 36 days in terms of a well blowout to get a capping stack, even on site, that's not capping it. And then 115 days to drill a relief well. Well, I confronted Equinor about this. I said, this is kind of ridiculous. That's a huge amount of time. And was told at the time, we don't operate anywhere where that's the case. So I said, well, can you get me the actual numbers? Because these are the numbers we were given from Equinor. Can you get me the actual numbers? Got the response back, and it was just, we follow the best practices possible. And that was it. That was the entire response. I was like, that's not you. So you told me one thing in a meeting. You told me that isn't the case. Your official statement was that it is, and then I get the statement that just you follow generally. So it's like I don't know what's going on at that level to not do that, to not consider the tides.
Yes, it's unbelievable, just unbelievable. Well, it's the nature of these oil companies, They just hide things from us. It's amazing. It's just
No, it is. And I'm curious, have they given you any sense of if there was a spill, what their cleanup time would be, or what their response time would be, or if there was a well blowout, how they would take care of it.
This environmental impacts report is just to give us those answers. The time to remove the oil, the place where the emergency groups would be established. So that's why they have to present this report.
For people who are listening in, most of them are probably going to be in Canada. How can they help support your work, and how can they learn more about this?
I think people are separated by boundaries around the world, but those companies doesn't have boundaries. They act globally. So you have to be worried about bacalhau field as I am, as any Norwegian is. Also, Americans or Chinese, everybody should take part in this battle, you know. As a developed country like Canada, you should lead by example, work in the direction of transition towards renewables, just work all together to tackle this huge problem we're having.
I think it's an important thing for a lot of Canadians to hear, because one of the things the oil and gas industry tells us in Canada is, well, Canada has done its part. It doesn't have to do anything more. And it's ridiculous, you know, we've been
It's not enough. It's just not enough. Look inside your country. You have to look everywhere. You have to exchange knowledge. You have to exchange activism. You have to exchange everything and help us to work. Now we're closest to the problem, but the problem is global. Everybody is involved.
It's a community issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we're all part of. And I'll put some links to the Equinor Out campaign below as well. Carlos, is there anything else you'd like to say before we go today?
Well, we are here working, trying to do something to avoid new oil projects, and I think everybody should join this campaign. We have no room for more oil in our planet to burn fossil fuels. Everybody should participate. Everybody should be aware of the problem and help everywhere in the world where they can.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you for having me.
So just jumping back into the Q&A for today's episode, and just before we get into it, a reminder that our answers to Q&A questions are on behalf of ourselves and not on behalf of guests. So we had somebody write in saying we'll always need a lot of fossil fuels because of Canada's long cold winters, because of different larger vehicles that we use, because of machinery, and because of all the other things that we run on oil and gas. And because chemical processes use large amounts of it for the manufacture of everyday items like plastics. And then also arguing at the same time that there's no evidence that CO2 causes global warming. Well, let me get to that last point first. There's all the evidence in the world that CO2 causes global warming. I'm going to put a link underneath this podcast episode to where you can see all the evidence. It's a great website that actually goes through every single argument against climate change and debunks them and shows that CO2 does in fact cause global warming and climate change. Now I sense that maybe we're past the point of no return here on that, but for anybody else who's listening, who's dealing with this kind of misinformation in their life, you can go there and you can find out more about why all the myths you're hearing about climate change are wrong and why they're wrong. And it's worth taking a second to review that. We actually had a great podcast episode earlier with the person who helped develop that website, John Cook, and I suggest you check that out because it's a really interesting talk about how facts fit into our discussions around climate change. So that's dealing with that last point. Now I'm going to move on to the we will need a lot of fossil fuels question. So first of all, I want to say something in order to talk about this issue in a larger way, which is, and I've said this on a podcast before, I never blame people for being dependent on oil and gas. I never blame people for having to work in the industry to produce it, to transport it, the use of it in things that we actually need it in. There's no blame there. It's just the way things have been, and we need to transition out of it. I do blame the people who spread the misinformation about oil and gas, the communications people who work for oil and gas corporations. Those people are to blame for our being stalled on a regular basis on progressive climate policies. Because the reality is, yes, we are dependent upon fossil fuels for a lot of these things. However, for almost all of these things, we now have credible alternatives or extremely close to them. And when we look at things like transport, for instance, especially for personal transport, we have a lot of options now to change that, whether it's going towards public transport. Yes, maybe it's some degree of electric vehicles. All of those things are possible now in ways that we are seeing just exponentially get easier and easier to do. The problem is we don't have policies to support those things on a rapid enough basis in order to deploy them. So the issue is not the solutions are not there, because the solutions are. We know how to get most of these things off of dependence on fossil fuels. But we just need to do it. And that's where policy comes in, and that's where implementation comes in, and that's where political will to act comes in. And contrary, that's where the blame goes on those oil and gas lobbyists, because they specifically are the ones who have stalled that effort. Are we going to use some degree of petroleum in products going forward? Yeah, sure. There are some products that we're not going to be able to produce without that. But the scale of the industry that we're talking about relative to what we have today with our use of fossil fuels as our primary energy fuel source for transport is totally different. It's a totally different scale, and it's nothing that requires the sort of oil and gas expansion that we're talking about in this episode. We know we actually have the reserves of oil and gas. We know them. We've developed them in order to get us through a green transition. We have them right now. We don't need to keep expanding. We don't need to keep going out there and finding new reserves. We don't need to be building new oil projects like Beta Nord or building Bacalhau in Brazil. We don't need that in order to make this transition work. And the sad part about this dependence that we have is that it has become defensive. We're all dependent upon oil and gas, therefore we can't say that we don't want to be, because otherwise that makes us a hypocrite. Well, you can see the problem in that argument. Go back 100 years and talk to somebody who has a horse-drawn carriage and say, well, I'm dependent upon horses, so I can't argue for motor vehicles, even if they're better, right? Like, that argument sounds ridiculous. What, did the big horse lobby get involved? And that's the reality, is that there's no reason to feel guilty because you're dependent upon something, but it is important that we do everything we can to change the system so that we can get off of dependency on that thing. That's where the initiative comes to, and I think that's where the defensiveness comes down to. And when we talk about, again, the use of oil and gas in all sorts of things, whether we're talking about farming, whether we're talking about transport, whether we're talking about emergency services, whether we're talking about agriculture, all of these different areas, we have the tools there already to make this work. We're even seeing overlaps where now we can actually build solar farms in a way that helps encourage local ecosystems. That's really cool. Like actually turning those spaces into places that support a local ecosystem as well. We're seeing the overlap and the collaborations that we can have in these solutions, because the solutions exist and it's more a matter of deploying. Two other quick things. There's a mention here of Canada having particularly cold winters, which would make, for instance, renewable energy hard to do. Well, we debunked that actually. We have a good episode out there on did renewable energy cause damage to Alberta's power grid. You should go check it out because we talk about why that's wrong. As well, on the plastics thing and the maintaining some dependence on oil and gas for certain products, well, one thing we're advocating for at Sierra Club Canada is a shift to a circular economy, where to the best degree possible, we're recycling as much as we can. This is an integral part, a fix that we want to see as part of the renewable energy drive as well, going to recycling a lot of the things from renewable energy too. That's a huge part of that solution as well, but that is, again, entirely possible. So that's going to lower a lot of demand for those things as well. And when we talk about a circular economy, we're not just talking about recycling as we know it now, but we're talking about repurposing, reusing, reducing. We're talking about things like the right to repair, where you should have the right to repair the products that you own rather than having to go get new ones that cost you a huge amount when the fix is much, much cheaper. Things like that. We're talking about a different way of approaching our economy, and that's again, something that we can do. And more to the point, something that will give people a lot more freedom around the things that they own than they have right now. I hope that answers your question. Again, I sense, maybe for the person who sent in this question, we're past the point where we're going to have a reasonable conversation on this topic, but maybe I'm wrong, so I'm putting the links to this information below this podcast. And for anybody who is listening who's dealing with this sort of commentary in their lives, I hope you check them out too. And I hope you listen to people like Carlos, who are on this podcast, talking about why it's not an us versus them thing globally to act on climate change. We all benefit when we all act. And it's about collaboration. And yes, it is about countries like Canada and Norway setting examples for the rest of the world because we have the means to do so very easily. And contrary to all the misinformation that you've heard out there, which we've covered on this podcast in depth, climate policies are not the things that are costing us. If anything, our dependence upon oil and gas is what has cost us so much. We've based our economies around these incredibly volatile products that we have very little domestic control over sometimes when it comes to pricing. And by transitioning to renewable energy and to renewable alternatives, we actually gain better local control. We have to make sure that when in that transition, we're doing it in a way that respects communities' wishes, that works with communities to develop those resources, that ideally gives them power over how they develop their own energy. We talk about that a lot when we talk about energy democracy and how Sierra Club Canada in particular has argued strongly for energy democracy as the framework for the renewable energy transition, because that would give communities control over their own energy sources. That's our argument on that. But overall, if we do the right things now, things can get better. We won't avoid the worst impacts of climate change that we've already set in motion, but we will avoid far worse ones that we can set into motion if we don't act right away. Thank you for listening in. Before we go, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues like this one by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, and events and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.